Hi everyone, how are you doing today? I thought we'd talk about my favorite genre today, which is the sea story. And I think I've mentioned this a few times in the past, but I've always loved watching, reading, or even listening to anything that has to do with the sea. And I think it's because when I was young, nearly every spring, we'd go to Oregon and spend a few days at the beach, and I just absolutely loved it. It was like the most beautiful place on earth to me then and also now. And I just think about the ocean with so many fond memories of flying kites and looking for shells, watching the ocean at night from the window. And a lot of my favorite stories also take place at sea. So I'm going to talk about some of those today and also share with you a very old review that I wrote of Moby-Dick. So let's get started. Speaking of childhood, one of my favorite stories was, and still is, The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I didn't read this until fairly recently, in the last 5 years or so, but I grew up watching the old movie with Spencer Tracy and absolutely loved it. The Old Man and the Sea is the story of an old Cuban fisherman down on his luck and his supreme ordeal, a relentless, agonizing battle with a giant marlin far out in the Gulf Stream. Written in 1952, this highly successful novel confirmed his power and presence in the literary world and played a large part in his winning of the 1954 Nobel Prize. It's a simple and short story, and it's just, that is really what makes it so great. It's not the kind of book that is really, it doesn't demand a lot from you, and yet if you really think about what he's saying in this book about old age and about survival and just all these universal themes, you realize what a brilliant book this is. Tristan and the Classics did a really good review of this, so I will link to that in the video in the description too. So check that out for a in-depth review. This is one of my go-to feel-good stories, and I will be certainly reading it again. Another story that takes place at sea, which I've mentioned really recently, is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader from the Chronicles of Narnia. I think this book, in some ways, stands alone because it introduces a new protagonist who is used to Scrub, the incorrigible cousin of the Pevensey siblings, and his personal journey from his absolute disgust at being taken to Narnia, and then his whole character arc as he becomes more attuned to the changes he's going through and the adventures they're experiencing. There's a lot to this little children's story, and I really think that Lewis did very good at the sea story arc, because one of the things that I just think is brilliant about this format or this genre is a good sea story basically encapsulates the entire world in a very small place. So in this case, the Dawn Treader is a particularly small ship, but just throughout history, that's typically been the case up until fairly recently. And what really appeals to me is seeing how people interact with each other in these small spaces, and how, the kind of conflicts that come up, the power plays and the hierarchy, and of course the existential themes that come about, especially in certain authors such as Conrad. And all of that's really great. You can see glimmerings of that in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but at heart it is a children's novel with enough in it that grown-ups will enjoy as well. So just had to shout that out. I think it's a worthy sea story. Now, my favorite is actually, one of my very favorites is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I owe you guys a whole video on Jules Verne, but this book in particular has long-standing sentimental value to me because when I was very young, my mother and I attempted to read it, or rather she was reading it to me, and we got kind of bogged down by all of the scientific technobabble, if you will. Honestly, though, Jules Verne did a ton of research for his books, and I really respect that, and I think that it really shows in this book. It's just that for the average reader, it's kind of heavy sometimes. However, in spite of that, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is a supreme sea story because it takes place on a submarine, of course, and you have the reluctant prisoners of the Nautilus and the dual nature of their exploration, both of the oceans that they travel through and also of the character of Captain Nemo, who runs this submarine. So I think this is a fantastic story in spite of all the science that may be difficult to read. Personally, I actually prefer the Disney adaptation of this from the 50s, and it is very dated and it is quite cheesy in parts, but that was one of my very favorite films growing up. Might be my favorite film of all time, and I just think that it was one of those rare, truly brilliant moves of Disney to just go all out in this real live action film and have an all-star cast and just really take it seriously in spite of the musical numbers or whatever. By the end of the movie, it's just incredibly dramatic and really deeply thought-provoking. So anyway, would recommend trying the movie if you haven't. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but I really, really like it. And I also love the book. If you're going to read the book, would strongly recommend the F.P. Walter translation. It's just really good. And some of the other ones, not so much. Another Jules Verne sea story I like, and this one I don't care for the translation, but it's called Lighthouse at the End of the World, and it's about these lighthouse keepers who are basically isolated at the extreme tip of South America on Staten Island. So, yeah, it's again a great story. Verne really had a lot of stories up his sleeve, and I just think that I enjoy the setting and the drama in this quite a bit, even though, again, translation could be a lot better, but it's worth checking out if you like Verne, and it's one of his more readable books, I would say. So no reminiscing of childhood would be complete without mentioning Robert Louis Stevenson. And unfortunately, I don't have a copy of Treasure Island with me. Treasure Island is, the pinnacle of sea stories in classic literature and following a young boy, which makes it even more, I think, full of conflict because you're kind of worried about what's going to happen to him and which side is he going to join and all this stuff as the ship gets compromised by piracy. Another book, though, which actually does have a significant portion that takes place at sea is Kidnapped, which is a historical fiction novel that takes place in the 1700s in Scotland. And the whole first part is a sea story. I absolutely love Kidnapped. It's got one of the greatest portrayals of friendships in all of literature between David Balfour, who is the protagonist, and his frenemy, shall we say, in the person of Alan Breck Stewart, a Scottish patriot who, well, I'm not going to give anything away, but I really recommend giving Kidnapped a try because I think it's even better than Treasure Island as far as the character development, and it's just one of those books I've actually read several times, and I don't really do that a lot, especially nowadays, but it's one I read every so often just because it's good every single time. And the part that takes place at sea is quite exciting. So Kidnapped, sort of a sea story, and one I would definitely recommend. Here's one that I read as a child. I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading as a child due to some of the subject matter, but this is The Bounty Trilogy by Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall. Now, this is a somewhat sensationalized historical fiction account of the mutiny on the Bounty, a real-life mutiny that occurred in the 1780s. So the first book is called Mutiny on the Bounty, and it's about that event. The second book is called Men Against the Sea, which is about the fallout after the mutiny when the captain and his followers are just set adrift on the sea in these boats. And then Pitcairn's Island is the third novel, which talks about what happens to the mutineers. And really, again, this is fictionalized in some parts, or at least sensationalized, but it's really quite a good read for older readers, and I think that my favorite book was actually Men Against the Sea, which is about the captain. Quite a gripping story about how people survive in such extreme circumstances. Yeah, I'm planning to read this again. I haven't read it in like probably decades, but it left a big impression on me, and it was definitely an adventure. Definitely something you could read during the summer and just, kind of be in this zone for a while. Similarly, now this is a book I haven't actually read yet, but Master and Commander by Patrick O'Brian. So this comes under the naval fiction genre, the Royal Navy, and the Napoleonic Wars specifically, which is when I think a lot of them do take place. And I actually, like I said, haven't read this book. It's on my list. What I have done is I've watched the film starring Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany of recent WandaVision fame, and I just really was blown away by that movie. It's so good. I think they struck a good balance between resonating with modern audiences through some of the themes and the way they told the story, but also a trueness to the era and just incredible costumes and cinematography and script. And the music is amazing. This soundtrack is one of my favorite soundtracks. So if I haven't raved enough, and if you haven't seen the film and that kind of topic interests you, be sure to watch it at some time. It's just one I watch every so often with my family because it's such a great experience, and the scenes are so well crafted, and the friendship between the two main characters, the captain and the surgeon, are just so compelling and true to life. I just love any books that have a really good dynamic between the main characters, to the extent that sometimes you're not even sure which one's the main character because they're both so real and so just very, very compelling. So yeah, Master and Commander, one of my favorite movies. I haven't, like I said, read the books yet, but it's definitely on my short list. Another classic, which I think most people may have heard of, is called Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. And this one kind of steps a little bit away from the adventure. I mean, there is plenty of it in this book, but it focuses a lot more on psychology. This is about a sailor who makes a very questionable decision and has to live with it the rest of his life. And the book just delves so deeply into that dilemma, and also idealism and romanticism with a capital R, and just like I really find it a little hard to describe other than that because it is so abstract. But this book definitely left an impression on me. And if you know Conrad, he's one of those authors that if you like him, you'll just be like, you just sort of chew on his words for a long time afterwards. And I don't know, this was one of those books. It's not my favorite of his works, but as a story of the sea and some of the moral conflicts that come into play, I think it's really, really worth reading. On a similar note, I would say, is Herman Melville's Billy Budd. Billy Budd is also a Royal Navy story, I believe. I think it is. And it's just a short story or even novella about a young man who gets into trouble with someone on his ship, and then it kind of turns into a legal drama, but also an ethical drama about law and order and discipline and intention. Honestly, reading this, you'll just be very, very conflicted. And it's quite a tragedy, but I really think this is not read enough, and I think that it touches on themes that are still highly relevant today, even though we don't live in quite the same kind of culture they did back then. Quite a bit different, but there are definitely things that translate, and just get your mind thinking. If you like a psychological drama, then you will probably really love Billy Budd. There's also a fantastic movie from the 60s, I believe, which I would also check out, especially if you read the book and just want to explore the story again in cinema form. So the last thing I'll mention before going to Moby-Dick is a couple of nonfiction books. So Shackleton's Voyage to the Antarctic. This is just an excerpt, but the full book is called South, and I've talked about that quite a few times. Definitely captivated my interest. And then Jack London. I don't have his book The Sea Wolf with me, but that is certainly a dramatic sea story. A bit violent, so just heads up if you are sensitive to that kind of thing. It actually took me a couple of attempts to read it, but I finally did. Left a long-lasting impression on me, especially the philosophical issues he deals with in that book. If you've done any cursory reading in philosophy, you'll recognize some of those topics that were really coming up at the end of the 1800s, and he just sort of nicely summarizes them in the main characters in The Sea Wolf. The Cruise of the Snark is his nonfiction account of sailing in a yacht to the Pacific, and he talks about landing in Hawaii and what that was like. I don't remember a lot of details from this. I just know that I enjoyed reading it and seeing what some of those places I visited were like back in the day, and sort of contrasting Jack London's life with his ideals of the world and so on. Definitely interesting historically and literarily. So yeah, that's that. I wanted to now turn to an old book review I did of, let's see here, I've got to pull it up here. An old book review I wrote of Moby-Dick. This is back from high school years, so it's not as good as my recent things. And some of it might even be kind of cringe, but we're gonna read it anyway, or at least I'll read you some excerpts. I might have to take some stuff out if it's super cringe. I'll just go through what my thoughts were of Moby-Dick at the time. I think most people think of Moby-Dick as the great American novel, or even, the greatest sea story of all time. I don't know that I would go so far in either direction, but I will say that it's been a book that's had a huge impact on me. And what do I mean by that? Well, the first time I tried to read it, I really did not get into it. So first of all, I started out watching the movie from the 50s starring Gregory Peck. That's also one of my favorite childhood films. I had some interesting film choices back then, but I think it's just one of the greatest movies ever made, and I think the reason for that is it just builds up so beautifully, and the cinematography is very atmospheric, and the casting is superb. I mean, Gregory Peck, he was just brilliant in pretty much everything, and he humanizes Captain Ahab without losing the maniacal side of him. And I don't know. I've just always loved that film. It's still a huge favorite. So going into the book, I had a lot of expectations. And the first time I tried to read it, I actually stopped about a third in. And the reason I stopped was because if you've tried reading Moby-Dick, you know that it goes into basically encyclopedia territory. And Melville just goes on and on and on about whales and their anatomy and all that wonderful stuff. And so, at the time, I wasn't really interested. And I really just wanted to read the story, and I gave up because I was like, I'm not into this. I tried it again some years later, and I read it more as a bedtime story. So when I got to those slow parts, I just kind of went with it. And then once I got past that part, I actually really loved the entire book, even those slow parts, and just fell in love with it. So it was really a matter of reading it at the right time. And then I wrote some thoughts on it, which I don't think I ever posted on any of my blogs. So I'm going to read through that right now, and we'll see what I thought. When Ishmael, the narrator, joins the crew of the Nantucket whaling ship Pequod, he doesn't quite know what to expect. A newbie to whaling, he finds a whaler's life a whole different world than that of the merchant service, and the Pequod itself, surrounded by foreboding and under the command of a mysterious captain, is not a typical whaling ship. Once out at sea, Captain Ahab makes his agenda plain to everyone. He's sworn not to return home unless he kills Moby-Dick, the monstrous white whale who injured Ahab on his last voyage. And thus, imprisoned on the Pequod and to Ahab's command, the crew begin their maddened hunt around the globe, and with the ever-growing premonition that they'll never make it back. As I soon learned during my first attempted reading of Moby-Dick, this book is far from what I'd call a swashbuckling sea story. Though the story itself is short, the book is rather long. See the history section below. The net result is that the book is slow. Furthermore, there is very little drama or action, and most of it is due to the whale hunts. The characters are what mostly drives the story, if this story could be considered as driven by anything. Captain Ahab, arguably the main protagonist, is insane and a monomaniac. This much Ishmael conveys to the reader. Ishmael also implies that this insanity began right after Ahab's leg was severed by Moby-Dick. Surprisingly, though Ishmael talks about Ahab's madness, I never seem to be able to fully understand Ahab's character. This is only one of the mysteries in Moby-Dick. Let's see, I also have some thoughts on the characters here. As shown in the story, Captain Ahab is also very evil. Within the last 100 pages or so of the book, this gets so bad that at times it's barely readable. I recommend skipping the chapter called The Forge. And then, in contrast to his madness and sin, we also get a few glimpses of Ahab's sanity, and with that his cunning, and even moments where he seems close to repentance of his vengeance on the whale. Believe it or not, Ahab is also a charismatic character, and it's in his charisma that he is able to win over most of the crew to his cause. The crew is made up of men from all over the world and from vastly different backgrounds. Most notable are Queequeg, the harpooner whom Ishmael befriends, second mate Stubb, who takes almost everything as a joke, and first mate Starbuck, who is second in command after the captain. Starbuck is the only character on the whole ship who isn't won over to Ahab's side. From the very first time he hears of the captain's plan, Starbuck is outspokenly opposed to it, and throughout the voyage he struggles between his sense of justice, duty, and moral principles as he tries to do the right thing. He's my favorite character, and I only wish he were in the book more, as opposed to Ishmael, who is incredibly annoying. I do remember that, I just did not like Ishmael. Fun fact, Starbuck is the namesake for Starbucks coffee. I think originally they were going to go with the Pequod, but for obvious reasons that just didn't fly. Okay, so let's go down. To the next section, Moby-Dick as history. I would venture to estimate that literally 60 to 70% of this book is purely educational and mostly nonfiction, in which Ishmael describes whales and the process of whaling. Describes it, and in great detail. He can go on for chapters about it, actually taking a break from the story. Needless to say, unless you are interested in learning about whales, whaling, and the age of sail, this book is probably not for you. And even being the sea story geek that I am, I found parts of it to be quite tedious. However, once I got used to this writing, small pieces of story sandwiched between larger chunks of whaling information, I began to appreciate the educational stuff and even enjoyed reading it. Sometimes Ishmael can get way too carried away. To hear him talk, it sounds like he would worship whales. But when he's not getting too carried away, I can almost sympathize with him, writing about a topic that few people care about, and yet writing with such enthusiasm that he makes you care about whales too. For example, one of the last things he says about whales is that he believes they won't go extinct. I ran over to a computer and looked it up on the internet. Sure enough, as I expected, sperm whales are now an endangered species. By this time, I was literally so sad that for a moment I seriously wanted to become a whale conservationist. There's no denying that Melville is a very persuasive writer. The information about whales and whaling became genuinely fascinating. The size of the whales, their habits, the process of hunting whales, how the whalers got the oil from the whales, etc. It was explained pretty well, I thought, and in some ways easier to understand than the movie version. And Melville's writing perspective varied a great deal. Sometimes he portrayed the whales as vicious and the whalers as tiny, fragile beings and victims, but probably more often he took the whale side and portrayed the whalers as cruel, murderous hunters. Though I think he unnecessarily went to both extremes, having these two perspectives was overall pretty fair of him. As for all the various whaling accidents and things that happen throughout the book, we are told that many of these things did actually happen in real life. It gave me a much better understanding of whaling, and I felt more interested in the book, since it's so largely based on fact and not fantasy. And why is the history of whaling so important? Well, for the very simple fact that it's a notable part of American history. Just as Britain was famous for Nelson's Navy, the Americans were at the forefront of the whaling industry during the 1800s. This book takes you right into the culture of New England whaling, into an era which today is largely forgotten, but is no less interesting. So that was my little thing about the history. One thing I'll just add before we move on to the next part is if you want to learn more about that time period and whaling, there are some excellent documentaries and books about the wreck of the whale ship Essex, which was the origin story, or like one of the original inspiring stories for the novel Moby-Dick. It's literally about a ship that gets hit by a whale and what happens to the survivors afterwards. I actually did read the account by the one survivor, Owen Chase. I shouldn't say one survivor. I mean, he was one of the survivors. And it gets very dark. It's a very dark story. So I recommend looking into that. There's a couple of movies about it. I believe it's called Into the Heart of the Sea or something like that. I will link to that in the description, but I recommend those if this piece of history is interesting to you. Okay, the last part of my review here, it's a very, very long review. No wonder I didn't post it. This is a section called Moby-Dick as Symbolism. One of the most striking things about this book is the sense of contrast. Over and over again, the idea is stressed that the ship and many of its characters are American. But this, and more importantly, the idea of democracy that accompanies it, is sharply countered by Ahab's dictator-like rule of his ship and the crew. He's not always what one would call tyrannical. There are no floggings or anything, but he wants everybody and everything on the Pequod to be under his command and to work for his own goal. This is one of the more prominent contrasts in the book, but there are others as well, such as Starbuck and Ahab's conflicting beliefs. At the same time, there's also a sense of continuity because the story is set at sea. From what I've heard, there is supposed to be a lot of symbolism in Moby-Dick. I'm far from being an expert at recognizing symbolism and meanings in books, but I do care about what a book is trying to say, if anything, and in the end, I do want to know whether a book is worth reading or not. With some books, however, that is a very difficult question to answer, and Moby-Dick is one of those books. There are great differences between books which are scary, books which are melancholy, and books which are dark. The Lord of the Rings falls mostly into the first two categories, and while parts of it are dark, I wouldn't say that it is as a whole. But Moby-Dick, along with Lord of the Flies and Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, seems to me to be a very dark book. Captain Ahab, sane or insane, the psychology, and the various foreboding incidents make for a disturbing story, which is all the more intense because it's such a slow book, and when anything does happen, it stands out. Personally, I don't think dark books are worth reading unless they have an important message to them. So what is Moby Dick's message? Let me just pause right there for a minute. So I read this, like I said, in high school, and I think I would still agree with what I wrote here, except that I do think there are reasons you might read something that's dark that's not for the message necessarily. And I think after I discovered Kafka, my whole views on this kind of changed a bit. And I think there is something that is actually profitable if you find something that really resonates with you, and maybe it's not trying to teach you anything, but maybe it just makes you realize that you're not alone in whatever you're going through at the time. So I would scale back what I said here a little bit. By and large, I would say I still agree with it, but I think there's more to it than that. And actually, that's a topic I'd like to talk about in the future, so it might be a good future video. So here is some spoilery section that I have marked with spoiler warning. So I'm just going to finish with this last bit about Moby-Dick. And if you have watched this far, thank you so much. I hope to have more time to be making videos now, and I'm just really looking forward to sharing a lot more about books I've read in the past and books I'm reading now with you in the future. So here's my last thoughts on Moby-Dick, with spoilers. My interpretation, and it might not be the intended interpretation, is this. Captain Ahab represents a human being in his most extreme state of pride, thirst for power, and, in a sense, at the highest social status man can acquire. In other words, he represents a human being at his lowest, but simultaneously at his highest, in terms of his powerful absolute rule position, captain of a ship at sea, with little or no fear of mutiny, and under no government's authority. And then you have the whale, Moby-Dick, and the weathers, accidents, etc., which Ahab could never control. The story is about the battle between these two sides, and Ahab loses. And not only that, but he lost before he ever started fighting. As was hinted at throughout the book, the battle was futile. Time and time again, things worked against Ahab, and even on the very day he dies, he has the chance to turn back, but he chooses not to. His fatal pride, as Ishmael calls it, turns against him. This pride is part of his downfall. And I get the impression that it was part of the root of his mental downfall as well, even before he lost his leg. I think the book's message is, or could be, that ultimately God is in control, and no matter how much mankind advances in technology or self-esteem, there are innumerable things that will always be impossible for us to control in any way. Another message is that Captain Ahab is a good example of what not to become. Would Ahab have been happy had he been able to get what he wanted, the death of Moby-Dick? Of course not. And nor does he ever seem to believe that he will live through that event should it happen. Perhaps that's where his real insanity really comes in. He thinks that somehow he will be a fulfilled or more content person after getting revenge, while at the same time, he half fears that it will be the end of him as well. And isn't that a recurring theme in the real world? Some people dedicate their lives to bringing misery on others, usually through that same craving for conquest. It's what they want, but does it make them happier? It's all an illusion. They spend years chasing after Moby-Dick, when in reality it's their own pride and sin which injured them in the first place. This is the dual nature of this kind of selfishness, wanting to be the best and most powerful, while also refusing to take responsibility for one's self-destructive actions, blaming it on someone or something else. While striving to be the strongest, the person shows himself to be very weak, pathetically so. It's part of the tragic side of Moby-Dick. And then my last comment here. So while I doubt that this book was a must-read for me, it was both educational and thought-provoking. It left me with quite a few questions, though I'm not sure it's the sort of book which holds all the answers. Funny I said that because after I read Moby-Dick, I became obsessed with whales. Ishmael's, it totally worked. Like, he convinced me. And actually, I feel like this book has been very influential on me. Not just for in and of itself, but just the way I mean, you can tell in this book I really was stretched to the limits of my interpretive abilities at the time. So that was very useful for me to have that experience. And as far as my interpretation that I just read you, keep in mind I am reading from a Christian perspective, so that was the angle I took from it at the time. And frankly, I'm very interested to reread Moby-Dick and see if I have the same interpretation now, or if, life experiences or reading other literature has changed that in any way. I'm just really curious, honestly. Yeah, that was my high school review of Moby-Dick, which I just didn't think was good enough for the internet at the time. But I don't think it's half bad. I mean, I think I hit the highlights here and was able to somewhat articulate my reaction to the book. So that's all you can really hope for anyway. So thank you for sticking with me through this video, and I will see you next time.